I'll be back.
Is this working? Yeah, I think this might be better. Okay, how's this? Is it better? Great, okay. First I'd like to welcome you to the Church of MBB this nice Sunday morning. And I'd like to apologize in advance. It is a little bit difficult to talk about vision when you can't quite see straight. I'm a little bit medicated, so I hope that this works. But I've written some of my comments. I don't ordinarily like to work off of a written script, but I think it might be a little bit safer this morning to do that. I've been asked to speak about vision, and my sort of theme for this morning actually comes from Eleanor Roosevelt, who said this. She said, "You gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face. You must do the thing which you think you cannot do." And I believe this applies to each of us as individuals, and it also applies to us as organizations. So what are the things that we think we can't do? Well, first, in order to really understand this, we need to take a couple of steps back. Just before he died a few months ago, at the age of 68, Ray Schoenholz, who founded the Community Board Neighborhood Mediation Program, which was revolutionary at the time that it was created, and is still revolutionary today. He also founded Partners for Democratic Change, which created a whole new model for mediation programs in other countries, all of which are very successful. Shortly before he died, he gave a keynote speech to the Oregon Mediation Association, in which he spoke about what he called courageous conversations. Here's what he said. I'm quoting now. "What is the precondition for a courageous conversation?" He answers, "A resolute character, or persons of obstinate intent." I love that. Persons of obstinate intent. "The effort is courageous because it is fraught with danger, risk, and penalties, and often death. As we have seen in the Arab Spring and as we are seeing today in Syria, this is completely correct. When repression is great, the courage of those engaged in change is heroic. Not all courageous conversations are heroic, but they are always about change. When a conversation becomes a movement for change, which reflects broad discontent, then the conditions for change become ever more possible." While what he says here is correct about not every courageous conversation being heroic, I love the very beautiful statement by the poet Nate Sarton, who said, "Sometimes it is necessary to be a hero just in order to be an ordinary piece of human being." And these times become more and more critical as we move into periods of great social change. So several years ago, I wrote a draft of a training manual for MBB on how to organize and design and conduct what I thought of as dangerous dialogues. And I now see that what Ray and I were describing is essentially the same thing, in slightly different terminology. So the idea for today is really courageous conversations / dangerous dialogues. And here's what I believe this fundamental idea is. We need to build the capacity, both locally and globally, to talk with each other courageously about difficult, even dangerous issues, without alienating each other, generating chronic conflict, and failing to solve increasingly pressing social, economic, political, and environmental problems. That's what I believe the future is calling out to us. So, to understand why this is true, I think we need to begin with a few things that we know about the world that we live in. First, our lives are increasingly globalized, not only in terms of the reach and pace of transportation, communication, and economic interactions, but the impact of what we may earlier have considered to be distant, local problems. The air from Fukushima crosses the globe. Everyone is impacted by financial crises. If there is a virulent strain of bird flu, it will reach everyone everywhere. If there is war between Israel and Iran, the fallout from that war will touch every life in this room. So the problems that we're facing, species extinction, climate change, bird flu, all of these problems, economic, financial crises, none of these problems can be solved except globally, even by the most powerful nation states. So the consequences of this are actually quite enormous. What it means is that all of the basic problem-solving institutions, organizations, and methodologies that we have developed over the last several hundred years can no longer solve the problems that we are facing. To me, this is just the truth. What are these outmoded methods and institutions? First, military force and coercion. You can't stop species extinctions with military force and coercion. You can't stop bird flu with treaties and international agreements. You can't legislate using the rule of law to prevent climate change. It's not sufficient. It won't work. In addition to these, we can add administrative rules and regulations, policies and procedures. We can add the nation state as an institution, probably the most effective problem-solving instrument that was ever created, and it's been bypassed by the nature of the problems that we are now confronting. Power-based diplomatic negotiations. How many of the people in the room now were at Copenhagen during the climate change? There's Tom Kutak, who led our delegation there. A number of us who are here were present in Copenhagen. And one of the things that we have seen is not just in climate change conversations, but in other negotiations as well, how diplomatic negotiations can, like all other forms of problem solving, be organized by power, by rights, and by interests. And power-based negotiations are no different from other power-based solutions. Rights-based negotiations are no different from other rights-based solutions. Every one of them has a fallout, and that fallout is way too expensive for us today, and will be increasingly expensive for us in the future. I have to go further and add to this that one of the mechanisms that will not solve any of these problems is capitalism and market principles. It can't solve, not only can it solve species extinctions, it accelerates species extinctions, because once rhinoceros horns become a precious commodity, the price goes up because the demand has gone down, and now there is an almost unstoppable movement to eliminate all of the rhinoceros from the planet. The United Nations, as presently constituted, can't solve these problems, and yet the United Nations is the logical and next most important institution that requires development along with a series of other international and regional institutions in order to solve these problems. So what we see on the one hand is that conflicts are predictably going to accumulate along the cracks in these institutions. That's what conflicts do. They are the sound made by the cracks in the system. So as these institutions become less and less capable of responding rapidly, flexibly, adaptively to problems that are accumulating rapidly, flexibility and adaptively, conflicts will appear, and many of these conflicts will take the form of what we can think of as chronic social, economic, and political conflicts. We need to add environmental as well. So what this means is that there is a need for new institutions, new methods, new mechanisms. And as a result, we have seen in the last couple of years that mediation, collaborative negotiation, dialogue, and other collaborative skills have really grown rapidly, not only in the United States, but around the world. So, in my view, there is a direction that begins to emerge out of these various phenomena. So now let's take a look for a moment at MBB, and then we'll go back to the world, and then we'll look at MBB again. So over the last several years, we have been, I think, pretty successful as a startup organization in mobilizing volunteers, including yourselves, starting projects, conducting trainings, creating contacts with mediators in multiple countries, organizing chapters, beginning to get our work together. It's clear, however, that we have lots of lessons to learn that Deborah is going to lead us through in a moment about all of this work. And we are, I think probably the most important thing that we have done is to make a decision that we were going to learn from our mistakes. And without that, I don't think we would be able to have made the transition in the direction that we have been moving in. So we have sent mediators to a number of United Nations climate change talks, not just in Copenhagen, but before that in Bangkok, in Barcelona, in Bonn, in Mexico, in Durban, South Africa. And Tom, at least you were in Durban. I don't know if anyone else was in Durban. Oh, great. Terrific. So this is a really important initiative that MBB has created. And it seems to me that we have not given enough support and recognition to the people who have been doing this incredibly amazing work. But basically what we are doing is trying to convince delegates from around the world that climate change, regardless of what it may look like, can't be successful if they don't have an equally successful mechanism for resolving disputes over how this process is going to work. It's a very, very simple point. But here's what it is generically. Generically, what this represents is the necessity for mediation organizations and supporters of mediation to advocate everywhere in favor of conflict resolution as a built-in mechanism for solving problems. So far we have one of these with regard to climate change. But how is climate change any different from bird flu? So here's what happens with bird flu. There is the H5N1 virus, which many of you know has created a number of deaths. Death rate is approximately 80%. And there are only 3 mutations that are required for bird flu to be transmitted through breath and become as dangerous a pandemic as the Spanish influenza after World War I. That killed more people after World War I than were killed in combat in World War I. 3 mutations, that's all that's required. So what happens with bird flu? Well, the answer is that it pops up regularly wherever there are poor people and chickens or ducks. That means largely in Asia. So here's what happens in Indonesia. Individuals come down with bird flu, and the government of Indonesia collects the blood samples and sends them off to the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization coordinates all of those blood samples and does a kind of preliminary, sort of look at them, and then sends them off to pharmaceutical companies to create vaccines that people can be vaccinated with. And the pharmaceutical companies take those vaccines and sell them on the world market at a price that the Indonesian government can't afford. And therefore, a health minister is elected in the Philippines, or appointed, who says, if you aren't willing to change this, we aren't going to send you any samples anymore. So, of course, the Indonesian government is correct, because why should they send off blood samples if they don't get the vaccines they need to vaccinate their own population? And of course, the United Nations is correct, because it has to coordinate all of these things. It needs the blood samples in order to be able to do it. And of course, the pharmaceutical companies are correct, because it costs money to develop vaccines, and they aren't doing this out of the good of their hearts. They're doing this because they're a business, and they're trying to make a profit. So everybody's correct, and the whole thing is completely insane. Okay, completely and totally insane. It's a guarantee that there will be a pandemic. So this year, in the absence of any mediators, any professional mediators, finally the parties got together after 6 years of this kind of turmoil and reached a very, very modest agreement in which the pharmaceutical companies will give the Indonesian government and various other third world governments access at a lower cost to these vaccines. Even at a lower cost, there will be people who will not be vaccinated. In the United States, we had a big debate about whether illegal immigrants, quote unquote, undocumented immigrants, should be covered under medical care. And the general answer has been no, they shouldn't be covered under medical care. Well, where do you think bird flu is going to crop up? Precisely in that population. And they're not isolated on some little island somewhere where you can say that it's safe to do this. They're, of course, a part of all of our life. And it isn't possible for us to create a solution to this problem except collaboratively, except globally, except using conflict resolution mechanisms. That's the only way forward. And that's true not only of bird flu, it's true of species extinctions and climate change and all of these other various issues. The second point that I'd like to raise, however, is slightly different from this, and it's a move in a different direction. The United Nations, the European Union, and many other countries around the world are moving in increasing numbers and with increasing speed to expand the use of mediation in domestic and international disputes. There's no question in my mind, given the nature of the problems, that this is going to continue. However, at the same time, there's another trend that has been created, which is the global financial downturn. And that has drastically reduced the availability of funding for expanding precisely the conflict resolution programs that we believe are extremely important. More importantly, however, it has highlighted another set of problems, and that is problems within the United States that we can see that are not limited to the United States, of the nature of political rhetoric and dialogue, which has become increasingly adversarial, increasingly demonizing, leading to stalemate and distrust. In fact, I think we can safely say, given the tone of the present electoral campaign, that no matter who is elected President of the United States this year, half the country is not going to trust them. Correct? What way of running a problem-solving mechanism is this? It's simply completely dysfunctional, and it guarantees the continued existence of all of the problems that we are talking about. Now, what this means is that mediators are going to have to do something different. Because for the most part, we have stood to one side in these political clashes, clashes that have led to the Occupy movement, clashes that have led to the Tea Party, to all of the conflicts that are taking place in Washington. Question number one, do we in fact have the elements, at least some of the elements, of a solution to this problem? The answer is absolutely yes. We know we do. Because every single day we work in conflicts where people demonize each other, where they adopt adversarial methods, and we have developed a set of techniques that actually could have some impact on the nature of political discourse. Now this is 100 times more massive than anything 1,000 times more massive than anything we've ever spoken about before. But I believe the truth is that in order to solve these fundamental problems, we are being increasingly required to address the places where we are blocked from solving them. And one of them is the nature of political relationships and political discourse. So what is it possible for us to do in connection with politics? Well, if we take a look, for example, at election campaigns like the ones that we are having right now, election campaigns largely initially take place through debates. Within the field of conflict resolution, do we have a critique of debates? Yes, we do. An actually very well articulated critique of debates. We know that they're inherently adversarial. We know that they encourage cheap shots, personal attacks, sort of resort to underhanded tactics. Recently, what's his name? Who just died?
Steve Jobs.
Urban planning. He was in the New York Times the other day, writing about neighborhoods and.
James O. Wilson.
Yeah. So here's the basic idea. If you have a neighborhood in which there is a neighborhood that is kept up, basically, and broken windows are repaired, everybody in the neighborhood behaves differently. But if there is one building in that neighborhood with one broken window that is not repaired, morale goes downhill. And people begin to behave badly because they think it's okay to do that. Isn't this debate process a kind of broken window in our political neighborhood that is in fact destroying our ability to talk to each other and solve problems? And what's the point of politics? The point is to solve problems. That's what politics is about. If we go back to Aristotle, he said politics is the search for the highest common good. That's Aristotle's definition of it. What Aristotle does not mention, except by exclusion at the very beginning of his work on politics, he says we're not talking now about women or about foreigners or about slaves. Right? They're excluded from the political debate.
Thomas Jefferson.
The problem is you can't exclude people from that type of debate and still have the search for the highest common good. Common now doesn't include everybody. And here's what we see as a result of this. That in fact, from a conflict resolution systems design point of view, if we analyze this, we just look at it as mediators, here's what we would have to say. That because of the existence of slavery, there has been created within this society a source of chronic conflict. The conflicts will be generated out of the existence of slavery because nobody wants to be a slave, period. And that's the way it's going to continue to be. Therefore, from a conflict resolution point of view, we have to say slavery is economically costly to any society because it creates more conflicts within that society than would be created if you didn't have slavery. And therefore, what we can say from a conflict resolution point of view, not from the point of view of morality, not from the point of view of any type set of political ideas about slavery or other institutions, what we would say is this is a generator of chronic conflict, and there is a solution to this. So one of the sources of chronic conflict is very simply social inequality. A second is economic inequity. A third is political autocracy, in precisely the same sense. What's the alternative? The alternative to debate is well known amongst conflict resolution professionals. It is dialogue. So what would it look like if instead of political debates, we were to have dialogues, courageous conversations and dangerous dialogues over issues, hot topics that people find difficulty talking about? And frankly, we're not talking about them very much here. But we need to talk about, really, no, this is true, we need to ourselves learn how to talk about race, gender, abortion, immigration, Occupy, financial inequities, whatever it might happen to be, whatever the hot political topics are, we have to ourselves be the ones who begin to open these conversations. Not ignoring them and assuming that they're just going to solve themselves, which is kind of what we have done, but actually directly facing them, which means conquering our own fear of opening up a can of worms. There's no question that it's a can of worms. And it's a can of worms because it's a difficult social problem and we've put a lid on it for so many years. So here's what comes out of this, what emerges from this understanding. First, we can predict the following things about the world. Very safely predict these. And any vision that we have has got to take these predictions into consideration, it seems to me. First, global problems are going to become more widespread, severe, impactful, costly, and common. Second, conflicts will be triggered by these problems and escalate as more individuals, groups, nations, and ecosystems are impacted. Third, these conflicts will accumulate around the failures in local, national, and international response systems. For the ability to resolve these conflicts quickly and effectively will have a direct impact on the degree of damage they create and on the social cost of those conflicts. We talk about a financial bottom line, and there is a financial bottom line to conflict. There is also a social bottom line. There is also a political bottom line. And we need to see, I think, even in the United States, the power of the Arab Spring, which is the power of the people's belief in democracy and their willingness to fight and die for that democracy. We have, well, actually, Gore Vidal said many years ago that in the United States there are more elections and less democracy than any other country in the world. But elections don't mean democracy, particularly elections like the ones that we're having. Don't we, I mean, is there anybody here who believes that these are not phony elections, meaning that people are talking about all kinds of issues that nobody's ever going to vote on? Or if they do vote on them, they're using these issues as ways of driving wedges in between elements of the electorate. This isn't problem solving. And we've got enormous problems that have to be solved. And therefore, it's clear that not only will mediation, collaborative negotiation, and dialogue be more important in the future, but volunteer mediator organizations like Mediators Beyond Borders will continue to be necessary as an adjunct and support to international organizations like the UN and to build conflict resolution capacity in underserved communities. So here's what the picture looks like on a larger scale. We were the only mediation organization to go into New Orleans and to Mississippi after Katrina, the only one. We were the only mediation organization to go to Copenhagen and to the various climate change processes. We have been the only mediation organization to support the idea of conflict resolution within the Occupy movement. And This is likely to continue. It would be wonderful, actually, if we had a bit more competition. If there were a few more organizations out there that were willing to do this. But what characterizes these movements? And the answer is the courage on our part to look fear in the face and to decide that this is something that needs to be done and just go ahead and do it. And to whatever extent it may appear to people that professionalism is enhanced by distance from problem solving, to that extent we are moving in a completely different direction. We are redefining the nature of professionalism and including within it the element of citizenship. Now, citizenship, not simply in the sense of each of us may be having varying views about abortion or birth control or immigration or whatever those issues may happen to be. That's absolutely essential. The question is, can we talk about these things without screaming and yelling? Well, in most families, as you know, and in most polite communities, in most civil organizations, there are things you don't talk about. We don't talk about politics, and we don't talk about religion. Why? Because it's way too explosive. People's feelings are going to get hurt, and we want to retain the relationship. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, with the wanting to retain the relationship. And here's the great example. I don't know if Dave Joseph is here, but Dave and a group of others at the Public Conversations Project led dialogues between spokespeople for pro-choice and pro-life organizations over years, in which people talked about their differences, but they did it in a way. Nobody changed their minds as a result of it. That wasn't the object. The object was, can we not shoot each other? Can we, sort of give the civil society in which we live the space to have a relationship and at the same time disagree? This is not an easy thing to do. And I think anybody who's gone through families where there have been arguments like this knows that people get passionate about these issues and disagree about them. Are there mechanisms to retain that passion? Because we don't want to get rid of it. What we actually want to do is convert it into a slightly different form of conversation. And the answer is absolutely yes. Here is one question that can do that. Here's the question. What life experiences have you had that have led you to feel so passionately about this issue? One question. And now what we get is a story, a life, a human being. And with that human being, it's possible to accentuate the empathetic connections between them. So if we think for a moment about the central idea of Mediators Beyond Borders, stripped of all the rhetoric and the stories that we ourselves have surrounded ourselves with, it is basically to build people's capacity to resolve the conflicts in their lives. Why should these exclude social conflicts, economic conflicts, political conflicts? And to do this locally and globally, regardless of the scale on which they occur. Well, clearly, in order to do this, we have to help people talk about their differences openly, honestly, and constructively. That means, thank you, that means working with communities in Rwanda, Hutus and Tutsis, who will not form some conglomerate tribe or community or culture, but will retain their differences, and precisely the ability to have differences and retain those differences is a critical element of every genuine collaboration, every single one. So here's basically where I believe that we have problems that need to be overcome. Within MBB, we have several difficulties that we are facing, and here's some of them. First, We lack a sustainable financial base, and we are dependent on unpredictable personal donations. And what we need to do is to create ongoing sources of revenue. If we don't do this, we're in trouble because we can't sustain this. We can't continue going to Rwanda and to Nepal and to various other countries without sources of revenue. Second, and of course there's also a very high personal cost to members of traveling to distant countries that needs to be recognized. We need to do something to help with this. We lack a strong, clear agenda for both professional and student chapter activities. We have various ideas, but we don't have a great deal of support. And we don't have a really strong agenda that says, you know, for example, from the national office, here's a looming issue, the possibility of war between Israel and Iran. Can you more organize dialogues in your community and bring together Iranians and Israelis into a conversation about ways of resolving their differences? If we could do this in every single chapter, in every student chapter and in every professional chapter, simultaneously around the country and around the world, imagine what kind of an impact that might have. Fourth, we lack a strong international organizing initiative with outreach and clear expectations for goals and expansion, for global expansion, I'm sorry. And we need to clearly expand internationally and to make this a key priority in what we're doing. We need to reduce our frequent reliance on centralized, oftentimes unnecessarily, it seems to me, bureaucratic obstacles, and sometimes are too great an orientation to rules and protocols as opposed to values and vision, to participation and openness. We need to develop a rich and complex participation path for members in terms of projects, in terms of committees and chapters, from the least experienced person in our ranks to the most accomplished. There is unevenness in team building and collaborative skills in projects and chapters. We need to focus on how to build better teams and do this. And we lack a mechanism for creating the kinds of dialogues that I'm talking about, for organizing them, promoting them, and encouraging them. So in my view, we need to ask ourselves a couple of questions. Here's my way of phrasing them. Is it not clear that prejudice, elitism, chauvinism, and adversarial attitudes toward other races, genders, religions, nations, and cultures are preventing us from uniting against our common problems? Is that not clear? Is it not clear that the growing gap between rich and poor is generating chronic social, economic, and political conflicts? Is it not clear that our entire political system is so mired in adversarial relationships and conflicted communications that we can't solve our most pressing problems? So we are citizens as well as being mediators, and what I think we have not seen or understood fully is that conflict resolution processes, skills, and attitudes can enormously reduce these chronic conflicts and promote more effective means of problem solving. And if you're interested in more about this, you can take a look at the book that I wrote, which is now also out here, Conflict Revolution, Mediating Evil, War, Injustice, and Terrorism. This is what I wrote about. So to do this, it will be necessary to reinvent ourselves, but isn't this what we have taken on from the beginning? To reinvent our entire orientation. And it will also be necessary for us to accept the fact that we're going to make mistakes and we're going to lose some campaigns. So here's my final quotation, which is from the brilliant, independent, investigative journalist, I.F. Stone. I don't know if any of you heard of I.F. Stone. Here's what he wrote. The only kinds of fights worth fighting are those you are going to lose. Because somebody has to fight them and lose and lose and lose until someday somebody who believes as you do wins. In order for somebody to win an important major fight 100 years hence, a lot of other people have got to be willing, for the sheer fun and joy of it, to go right ahead and fight knowing you're going to lose. You mustn't feel like a martyr. You've got to enjoy it. So let's try some of these things and enjoy it.
Well, Ken, at the MBB congregation, thanks you for this homily. But unlike most congregations, we're going to give you a chance to ask a few questions while Deborah gets things set up for the next session. Give you a chance to sort of organize yourself.
I suggest not just questions, but comments, diatribes, lengthy speeches, outraged comments, whatever you'd like to offer.
Here, let me bring the mic. So,
in your worldview, so this may be a little bit,
speak to the mic.
maybe too active on board.
Mic check.
Speak on it. Yeah.
Thank you. I was in a small committee meeting of some professional ADR practitioners in the last week, and we were discussing what was going on in Syria. It really wasn't the purpose of the committee meeting, but it came up. And one of the people in the meeting mentioned that, we're having small children just slaughtered in the country, and we're not doing anything. And these were very experienced mediators. And one person, and that particular person said, we just ought to go in and bomb the presidential palace. Now, we all understand the ethnic conflicts that we resolve. But mediation is a slow process. Conflict resolution is a small process. We're having people slaughtered as we sit here, and nothing's being done. What is your reaction to what the world ought to do in that particular situation?
Very good. Great question. Thank you very much, Greg. From my own history is that I spent about 15 years as a political organizer during the 1960s and was active in the civil rights movement in the South and trained in nonviolent techniques. And I watched as other atrocities occurred that various people responded to in various ways. In my view, terrorism, in a sense, is a kind of emotional response to exactly the sort of the massacre that is taking place in us. It's something that we can all sort of get in touch with within ourselves, the desire to hit back, to do something to stop what's taking place. And it comes out of a sense of frustration, in my view, and sort of the feeling of powerlessness. So we remedy powerlessness through arrogant action. And what we have to be concerned about, I think, is the fact that whenever we respond to hatred with hatred, hatred wins. And what we need to do actually instead is to take that pain and that suffering and transform it into commitment, transform it into dedication to create a world in which these kinds of things will not occur. This world is a long ways off, and we've got an enormous set of obstacles to overcome in working with political regimes that are actually just gangs of criminals masquerading as political leaders. And there are countries, many countries around the world where this is actually a pretty accurate statement. The one truth that I know from this long view of how things change is that ultimately you can't stop people from achieving what it is that they want to achieve. You can't stop them from leading lives that have decency in them. This is more, it sounds more like an article of faith than a reality, but it seems to me that every sort of dictatorial regime sooner or later begins to confront a central problem, which is nobody believes in them. They're doing it out of fear. And all it takes then is for one person to say, I refuse to accept this fear. And that happened in the Middle East when a young man burned himself to death. And the conflagration spread throughout the entire region because the whole thing is dry tinder waiting to be ignited. And I believe that there is a similar truth about the work that we are doing. Here's what I think more specifically needs to happen as a result of this. Well, actually, Mediators Beyond Borders, in my mind, was born out of a similar frustration. I was watching television during the shock and awe bombing and watching the B-52s dropping these bombs. And of course, you can't be a mediator without experiencing empathy. And I began to empathize with the people on the ground and wondering what their lives would be like. And in a little moment of fantasy, my subconscious mind came up with this idea of, mediators parachuting by the tens of thousands out of these B-52s, with a clipboard and waiting to talk to people. But then I asked what I think was the transitional question, which is, what would you do when you hit the ground? And that was where the idea of Mediators Beyond Borders came from for me. So what I believe is that, and I say this having looking now over a period of 3 decades of practicing this work, things have grown remarkably during that period of time. The fact that we have a long ways to go is one truth. And the other truth is there is no question but that we can get there. Here's, if I can have just one more moment before answering another question if there's time for it. There's one last quote I'd like to read.
You got 1 more minute and there's 1 more question.
Okay,
So we're going to go to the next session.
Here's a quotation that's responsive. And this is from Claude Lévi-Strauss, who invented structural anthropology. He said, if men have always been concerned with only one task, how to create a society fit to live in, the forces which inspired our distant ancestors are also present in us. Nothing is settled. Everything can still be altered. What was done but turned out to be wrong can be done again. The golden age which blind superstition had placed behind us or ahead of us is in us. And what we need to do is to take that golden age that is in us and bring it out into the world.
Okay.
Great question.
Next question.